Maya's family reunion was supposed to bring joy and reconciliation, but when a disgruntled new neighbor, Mr. Robert, takes it upon himself to disrupt the gathering, tensions in the quiet suburban neighborhood threaten to boil over. As prejudices surface and conflict escalates, the family must decide whether to fight back or rise above, hoping to change not just one man's heart, but the neighborhood's future. Before we get started, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe for more exciting content, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's dive in. Maya stood by the window, brushing aside a delicate lace curtain, her heart full of anticipation. The autumn breeze carried the crisp scent of pine, mixing with the aroma of cinnamon candles she had carefully placed throughout the house. Her home, a humble but cozy cottage at the end of the street, was about to become the epicenter of warmth, love, and laughter, a place where old family wounds would hopefully begin to heal. This reunion had been a long time coming, and Maya hoped it would mend some of the fractures that had grown over the years between her family members. Outside, neighbors strolled lazily along the sidewalks, greeting each other with polite nods, oblivious to the storm brewing in the house next door. Mr. Robert, the new tenant in the pale green house across the street, closed his blinds just enough to obscure his face, but Maya felt the weight of his stare. His arrival in the neighborhood had gone unnoticed by most, but she had met him once, briefly. That one encounter had been enough to sense the man carried a world of anger beneath his polite exterior. Her thoughts shifted back to the preparations. Maya's father, Marcus, had called just an hour ago to tell her he was on his way. Marcus, strong, steady, and unflappable, was the glue that held their family together. Recently, he had also become the newly elected president of the local community association. His promotion was an effort to breathe life into the neighborhood, but it also made him the subject of attention from those who didn't appreciate change. Not that Marcus was easily shaken. He wore patience and dignity like a second skin. Maya hoped she could be more like him, especially with what lay ahead. She turned back to the kitchen, checking the food she had painstakingly prepared. The dishes reflected the diversity of their heritage: spiced rice, fried plantains, and sweet potato pie, all meant to honor her mother's southern roots, alongside traditional Caribbean dishes that paid tribute to Marcus's side of the family. The blend of flavors wasn't just a meal, it was a statement of unity. The soft chime of her phone interrupted her thoughts. Maya smiled as she saw the first text messages from her cousins and aunts. "Almost there. Can't wait. Do you need help with the drinks? So excited, Maya. Let's make some memories." This reunion, Maya believed, would be different. It was time to move forward, to leave behind the misunderstandings, arguments, and grudges that had festered between her siblings and cousins for years. They had grown up together, after all. Surely they could find their way back to each other. As the first car pulled into the driveway, Maya felt her pulse quicken. Her cousins, Leon and Tyra, emerged, greeting her with wide grins and bags filled with gifts and homemade treats. Soon, other relatives arrived, their voices filling the house with warmth, laughter, and chatter. Children raced through the backyard, their high-pitched giggles echoing across the neighborhood. But not everyone welcomed the gathering with open arms. Across the street, Mr. Robert stood by his front door, arms crossed tightly, eyes narrowed. He muttered to himself, a dark scowl etching deeper lines into his face. From the moment he had moved into this neighborhood, Mr. Robert had expected peace and quiet. It was a respectable, orderly place, a suburban enclave of well-manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and silence after 9 p.m. He liked it that way. The sight of Maya's family, loud, diverse, and unapologetically joyful, irritated him beyond reason. He muttered to himself, "It's only a matter of time before it gets out of hand." He had already begun making plans in his mind, though he hadn't decided on the details just yet. He told himself he was acting for the good of the community. A gathering like this would set a precedent. People like that, so noisy, so disruptive, couldn't be allowed to take over the neighborhood. As the day wore on, Maya's house became a beacon of festivity. Chairs were set up in the backyard, music played softly through a speaker, and the smell of grilled food wafted into the air. Her younger cousins played soccer on the lawn, while the older ones sat in clusters, catching up on lost time. Inside, Maya helped her father, Marcus, set out dishes on the long dining table. When he gave her a reassuring smile, she felt some of the tension drain from her shoulders. He knew how much this reunion meant to her, and she could always rely on him to handle things if anything went wrong. "I think we pulled it off," Maya said, brushing a stray curl behind her ear. Marcus chuckled. "You had it all under control from the start, kiddo? I'm just here for the food." Despite his easy demeanor, Marcus's eyes carried a depth of understanding Maya knew well. He had lived long enough to know that joy didn't always come without opposition. There were always those who didn't appreciate happiness that didn't fit within their narrow worldview. But Marcus was ready for that. He had learned how to face prejudice with kindness, a skill he was determined to pass on to his daughter. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, casting a warm orange glow over the neighborhood. It was the perfect evening, or at least it should have been. From his front window, Mr. Robert watched the gathering with growing resentment. He noticed the way neighbors passed by Maya's house without a word of disapproval, some even waving to the children playing on the lawn. This was not the reaction he had hoped for. "They don't see what I see," he whispered to himself, shaking his head. "Someone has to do something." In his mind, he was the hero of the story, the lone guardian standing up for what was right. He believed he was protecting the neighborhood, keeping it from sliding into chaos. And the more he watched, the more convinced he became that it was his duty to put an end to this gathering before things spiraled out of control. As Maya's family sat down for dinner, clinking glasses and sharing stories, Mr. Robert stepped away from the window, a determined look in his eye. "I'll deal with this," he muttered, grabbing his phone. The gathering storm had begun to swirl, though Maya and her family were still unaware of the dark clouds gathering on the horizon. What was meant to be a night of unity and healing was on the verge of being disrupted by a man whose fear of difference threatened to unravel everything. Maya couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She glanced toward the window, a flicker of unease settling in her chest. But when she saw her father smiling, laughing with relatives, she pushed the thought aside. For now, the house was filled with warmth, and Maya was determined to hold on to that, no matter what lay ahead. The storm would have to wait. For tonight, at least, the echoes of unity would not be silenced. The hum of conversation and bursts of laughter echoed through Maya's home as the family reunion hit its stride. People crowded the kitchen, sneaking bites of fried plantains, and the backyard buzzed with cheerful chaos as the children darted around the patio lights. Maya's heart swelled with relief as she soaked in the joyful scene. For the first time in a long while, her family felt whole. Meanwhile, across the street, Mr. Robert stood rigidly at his window, arms crossed as he watched the flow of guests arriving. He made a mental note of every new face, every new car that lined the street. His jaw tightened as he witnessed the easy laughter and the warmth exchanged between Maya's relatives. His fingers itched to act, to restore what he considered order. The first chance to act came sooner than he thought. By mid-afternoon, a neighbor named Mrs. Green, an elderly woman known for her sharp opinions, strolled by Maya's house on her way to collect her mail. Mr. Robert saw an opportunity. He opened his front door and waved her over, plastering on a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Afternoon, Mrs. Green," Mr. Robert greeted warmly. "I hope those folks across the street aren't bothering you with all the noise." Mrs. Green squinted in the direction of Maya's house. "Noise? Oh, heavens no. I think it's lovely. Maya's family doesn't get together often. It's good to see them reconnect." Mr. Robert's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Of course," he said smoothly, shifting tactics. "It's just, you know how things can get with a crowd like that. Too many people, cars parked everywhere, makes the neighborhood look cluttered, don't you think?" Mrs. Green gave him a sharp look, sensing the underlying tone in his words. "They're doing nothing wrong," she said firmly, clutching her mail tighter. "Besides, Marcus is leading the neighborhood association now. I'm sure he knows the rules better than anyone." Mr. Robert's lips thinned. Mrs. Green gave him a curt nod and continued down the street, leaving him standing on his porch, his irritation simmering beneath his polite facade. He had expected more support, but it seemed Marcus's influence had already spread through the neighborhood. Determined not to be outdone, Mr. Robert went inside, grabbed his notebook, and began making a list of grievances. Noise disturbance, parking violations, too many guests. He didn't care whether these complaints were factual, he just needed ammunition. Back at Maya's house, the reunion was gaining momentum. Marcus, Maya's father, stood at the grill, flipping burgers with the ease of someone who had mastered the art of backyard cookouts. The scent of barbecue drifted through the air, drawing more family members outside. Maya stood beside him, handing out plates and laughing as her little cousins tugged at her sleeves, demanding snacks. "It's turning out great, Dad," Maya said, glancing at Marcus. "Everyone seems happy." Marcus smiled, his warm, knowing gaze meeting hers. That's what family is for, patching things up, even when it seems impossible. For a moment, Maya let herself believe that everything would stay perfect, but that fragile peace was shattered the moment Mr. Robert approached the edge of their lawn. The older man had crossed the street, clipboard in hand, his expression pinched with disapproval. He stood stiffly at the property line as though stepping any closer would contaminate him. "Excuse me," Mr. Robert called, loud enough to catch the attention of those nearby. His eyes zeroed in on Marcus. "Are you in charge here?" Marcus turned off the grill with deliberate calmness and wiped his hands on a towel. "I suppose I am. How can I help you?" Mr. Robert's nostrils flared slightly, but he kept his voice level. "This gathering of yours is causing quite a disruption. A number of neighbors are concerned about the noise and the number of vehicles parked on the street." Marcus didn't flinch. He knew the complaint wasn't rooted in anything legitimate. "I understand," he said patiently, though his tone carried a subtle edge of authority. "But we're not breaking any community rules. It's just a family reunion, Mr. Robert." Maya stepped forward, her expression neutral, but her hands clenched at her sides. She could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface, like a coiled spring. "We've kept the music at a reasonable volume," Maya added, trying to keep her voice even. "And we made sure everyone parked legally. I don't think there should be any issues." Mr. Robert's jaw twitched. "Perhaps not yet, but it's only a matter of time before things get out of hand." Marcus gave Mr. Robert a long, measured look. "I see," he said softly. "Well, if you have any specific concerns, feel free to bring them up at the next community meeting. As the president, I'd be happy to address them." The subtle reminder of Marcus's new role didn't go unnoticed. Robert's face darkened, but he forced a tight smile. "I'll be sure to do that," he muttered, spinning on his heel and retreating back across the street. As soon as Mr. Robert was out of earshot, Maya exhaled sharply. "Dad, I don't trust that guy. He's not going to let this go." Marcus rested a hand on her shoulder. "I know, but don't let him ruin today. He's just one man, and he's not as important as what we have here." Maya nodded, but the encounter left a bitter taste in her mouth. She knew her father was right. Letting Mr. Robert's prejudices steal the joy from their reunion would only give him power. Still, a flicker of unease lingered at the back of her mind. Inside his home, Mr. Robert was already dialing numbers, intent on escalating his complaint. He reached out to neighbors he thought would support him, twisting the story to suit his agenda. "You know how these things go," he told one neighbor over the phone. "It starts small, and the next thing you know, it's a party every weekend. We have to nip this in the bud, or the whole neighborhood will suffer." The neighbor on the other end of the line hesitated, sensing the malice in Mr. Robert's tone but too polite to confront him. "Well, I suppose, maybe they could keep the music down a bit," they mumbled, half-heartedly. Mr. Robert took that as a victory. Every small concession fed his delusion that he was on the right side of things. Meanwhile, back at Maya's house, the reunion continued, though the earlier encounter weighed heavily on her mind. She found herself scanning the crowd, waiting for another unwelcome intrusion. Marcus, however, remained unbothered. He moved through the gathering with ease, reminding everyone why he had earned the respect of the community. His calm demeanor was a silent but powerful message. They wouldn't be intimidated. But Mr. Robert wasn't done yet. He had planted the first seeds of discord, and now he intended to water them. The storm was still brewing, and he was determined to stir up as much trouble as he could before the night was over. Maya only hoped that when the next confrontation came, they would be ready to face it, together. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the neighborhood in soft twilight. Maya's house radiated warmth. The family reunion was in full swing, with laughter echoing from the backyard and the clinking of glasses punctuating heartfelt toasts. Despite the earlier encounter with Mr. Robert, Maya had tried to let her guard down, focusing on the joy surrounding her. Yet, a sense of unease simmered beneath her smile. She knew Mr. Robert wasn't done. As the family settled down for dinner, a sense of camaraderie filled the air. Marcus sat at the head of the long dining table, his deep voice leading a prayer that brought momentary silence to the lively gathering. Afterward, the conversation erupted once again, filled with shared memories and light-hearted jokes. Maya could feel the healing beginning, old grudges slowly dissolving, misunderstandings cleared through laughter. But just as Maya started to believe they were out of the woods, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen and felt her stomach tighten. It was a message from one of the other community association members. "Just a heads up, Maya. Robert filed an official complaint with the city. He's trying to shut your event down." Maya clenched her jaw and slipped her phone back into her pocket, her pulse quickening. She scanned the gathering for her father, finding him by the grill, chatting with Uncle Anthony. She knew she needed to tell Marcus, but she hesitated. Her father was finally relaxed, and the family was happy. Couldn't they have just one evening of peace? Meanwhile, across the street, Mr. Roberts stood at his window, the phone still in his hand, smug satisfaction on his face. He had submitted the complaint with the precision of someone who believed they were fighting a righteous battle. If the city officials responded quickly, the event would be shut down within the hour. He wasn't content to stop there, though. He had also sent a flurry of emails to neighbors, twisting the narrative further. "It's out of control," he wrote. "The noise, the parking, it's a nuisance to us all. If we don't act now, this kind of behavior will become the norm." A handful of neighbors responded with hesitant agreements. "Maybe the music is a bit loud," one replied. "They should have asked us first," wrote another. While most of the neighborhood remained indifferent or supportive of Maya's family, Mr. Roberts' persistent complaints began to sow seeds of doubt. Back at the reunion, Maya decided she couldn't keep the information to herself any longer. She approached Marcus, who was mid-laugh, holding a plate piled high with ribs. "Dad?" she said quietly, tugging him aside. "We have a problem." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression still calm but instantly attentive. "What's going on?" Maya sighed. "Robert filed an official complaint. He's trying to shut us down." Marcus gave a slow nod, his face unreadable. "I figured he'd try something like this." "You're not surprised?" Maya asked, incredulous. "Not at all," Marcus replied. "People like him don't know how to mind their own business. But we're not doing anything wrong, and I won't let him ruin this." Maya could only marvel at how unbothered her father was, as though he had weathered these storms so many times that they no longer fazed him. She, on the other hand, felt a knot of frustration tightening in her chest. "What if the city sends someone over?" she asked, glancing nervously toward the street. "Then we'll handle it," Marcus said firmly, with dignity, just like always. But Maya wasn't the only one feeling the tension. The rest of the family, though still smiling and enjoying the evening, could sense the unease creeping into the atmosphere. A few of the older cousins exchanged glances, their conversations quieter now, their laughter more subdued. Inside the house, Aunt Lorraine, a no-nonsense woman with a knack for sniffing out trouble, pulled Maya aside. "What's going on, sweetheart? You look like you've seen a ghost." Maya hesitated for a moment, but decided there was no use hiding the truth. "Our new neighbor filed a complaint," she said softly. "He's trying to shut us down." Aunt Lorraine pursed her lips, her sharp eyes narrowing. "That man's got some nerve," she muttered. "Doesn't he know who he's messing with?" Before Maya could respond, her cousin Leon approached, holding his phone. "Yo, Maya," he said, lowering his voice. "I just heard from a buddy of mine. Robert's been spreading rumors about us all over the neighborhood, saying we're causing trouble." Maya groaned. "Of course he has." Leon cracked his knuckles, his expression darkening. "You want me to talk to him?" "I can." "No," Marcus interrupted, stepping between them with a steady hand on Leon's shoulder. "We don't escalate things. That's what people like him want, to drag us down to their level." Leon exhaled sharply. clearly frustrated but unwilling to defy Marcus. "Fine, but if he shows up here again, I'm not promising I'll stay quiet." Marcus smiled gently. "Just trust me. We've got this." As the family tried to refocus on the celebration, the tension remained, lingering in the air like a distant thunderstorm. Maya could feel the weight of years of prejudice pressing down on them, an all-too-familiar burden they had carried their whole lives. It wasn't just Robert's complaint. It was every insult, every sidelong glance, every moment they had been made to feel unwelcome. And yet, they refused to let it break them. They had come together to celebrate, to heal, and they weren't going to let one man's hatred undo that. Marcus moved through the crowd, greeting relatives with his usual warmth, as if nothing was amiss. His calm demeanor was contagious, slowly easing the tension among the family members. Maya watched him in awe. How did he stay so composed, so unshakable? She hoped that one day she could carry herself with the same quiet strength. But just as the family began to relax again, a pair of headlights swung into the street, casting long shadows over the lawn. A city official stepped out of the car, clipboard in hand, and made their way toward the house. Maya's heart sank. This was it. The confrontation was coming, and there was no way to avoid it. Marcus stepped forward to meet the official, his expression calm and welcoming. "Good evening," he greeted. "How can I help you?" The official, a young woman with kind but tired eyes, glanced at her clipboard. "We received a complaint about a disturbance," she said. "I just need to check in and make sure everything is in order." Marcus nodded. "Of course. You're welcome to have a look around." Maya held her breath as the officials scanned the backyard. The music was low, the guests were well behaved, and the cars were parked neatly along the street. There was nothing out of place, nothing that could justify shutting them down. After a few minutes, the official smiled. "Everything seems fine here," she said. "Sorry to interrupt your evening." Marcus smiled warmly. "No problem at all. Thank you for stopping by." As the official walked back to her car, Maya felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had made it through the storm, at least for now. But she knew this wasn't the end. Mr. Robert would keep trying, keep pushing, and they would have to be ready for whatever came next. Because the real battle wasn't just about one family gathering, it was about standing up against the prejudice that had festered for far too long. And Maya was determined that, no matter what, they wouldn't back down. The night sky stretched over the neighborhood like a dark quilt, dotted with stars that twinkled in quiet oblivion to the brewing conflict below. The music from Maya's backyard drifted softly on the breeze, mingling with the sounds of clinking glasses and warm conversation. The family had gathered around a fire pit, roasting marshmallows and swapping childhood stories. For a fleeting moment, it seemed like peace had settled over them. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that it was only the calm before the storm. She cast a glance across the street toward Mr. Robert's house, half expecting to see him lurking by the window again. Instead, the front door opened. Maya's heart skipped a beat as Mr. Robert emerged, storming across the street with a determined stride and an expression carved in stone. A cold knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. "Dad," she whispered urgently, nudging Marcus, who sat serenely by the fire pit. "He's coming." Marcus followed her gaze, his expression unchanged. "Stay calm," he murmured. "Let me handle this." The family fell silent as Mr. Robert reached the edge of the lawn, his face flushed with indignation. He stopped just short of the fire pit, as if the warmth emanating from it was a boundary he couldn't cross. "This has gone on long enough," Mr. Robert snapped, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're disturbing the whole neighborhood. This is unacceptable." The tension thickened, hanging in the air like smoke from the fire. Maya's cousins shifted uneasily, their eyes narrowing. Aunt Lorraine crossed her arms, her expression sharp and ready for a fight. Marcus rose slowly from his seat, his movements deliberate, exuding the same calm confidence he had shown all evening. He stepped forward, standing face to face with Mr. Robert, his height casting a quiet but unthreatening presence over the confrontation. "Mr. Robert," Marcus said evenly, "I understand you have some concerns, but we're not breaking any rules, and we've done everything we can to be respectful of the neighborhood." Mr. Robert scoffed, his eyes flickering with a mixture of frustration and disdain. "Respectful?" he repeated bitterly. You think blocking the street with all these cars is respectful? You think disturbing the peace is respectful? Marcus didn't flinch. There's plenty of room for cars, and the music is at a reasonable volume. I understand this gathering might not be what you're used to, but that doesn't make it a problem. Mr. Roberts' voice rose, a tremor of anger slipping into his words. This kind of thing attracts trouble. If we let people do whatever they want, this neighborhood won't be the same. I'm not going to stand by and let that happen. Maya felt a surge of heat rise in her chest. Anger, frustration, and a deep sadness that this kind of prejudice still lingered, even in their own backyard. But before she could speak, Marcus raised a hand, signaling her to stay back. I understand that change can be difficult, Marcus said, his voice steady but carrying a quiet strength. But this isn't about rules or parking, Mr. Robert. This is about something deeper. Mr. Robert bristled. I'm not prejudiced, he shot back defensively, though the tightness in his voice betrayed him. I just care about the community. And so do we, Marcus replied gently. This family has been a part of this community for years. We care about this neighborhood as much as anyone else. But we all come from different backgrounds, and it's those differences that make this place special. The neighbors, drawn by the raised voices, began to gather on the sidewalks, watching the exchange unfold. Some nodded in quiet agreement with Marcus's words, while others shifted uncomfortably, unsure how to react. Marcus glanced around, addressing the growing crowd as much as Mr. Robert. It's easy to be afraid of what we don't understand, he continued. But that fear doesn't build community, it tears it apart. If we want this neighborhood to thrive, we need to embrace what makes us different, not push it away. A murmur rippled through the onlookers. Mrs. Green, standing near the back of the crowd, gave a small but approving nod. Mr. Robert opened his mouth to respond, but Marcus wasn't finished. We've been respectful, Marcus said, his voice soft but resolute. We've followed every rule, and we won't apologize for gathering as a family or for being who we are. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Mr. Robert's face flushed with embarrassment, but something in his eyes shifted. Confusion, perhaps, or maybe the smallest hint of shame. For a long moment, he stood there in silence, surrounded by the very community he had claimed to protect. The neighbors were watching now, their expressions a mixture of expectation and quiet judgment. Mr. Robert had come here expecting to be the hero of his own story, but instead he found himself exposed, his fear, his anger, his prejudice laid bare for all to see. Maya's heart pounded as she watched the scene unfold, every muscle in her body taut with anticipation. Would Mr. Robert double down on his anger, or would he step back, realizing the futility of his fight? Finally, with a huff of frustration, Mr. Robert turned on his heel. He muttered something under his breath, something that sounded like, "This isn't over," and marched back across the street, his shoulders stiff with unresolved tension. A wave of relief washed over Maya, and she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The neighbors began to disperse, some offering nods and smiles in support of Marcus and his family. Mrs. Green caught Maya's eye and gave her a small, reassuring wink. Marcus turned back to the family, his expression serene. "All right," he said, clapping his hands together. "Who's ready for dessert?" A ripple of laughter spread through the group, and just like that, the tension dissolved, replaced by the warmth and joy they had fought so hard to protect. Maya smiled as she watched her father rejoin the celebration, marveling once again at his ability to navigate conflict with such grace. He had stood up for their family, not with anger or aggression, but with quiet dignity. And in doing so, he had won a battle that was far more important than the one Mr. Robert had tried to start. The fire crackled softly, sending sparks into the cool night air, and the family gathered closer together, united in the glow of their shared resilience. Maya knew that the challenges weren't over, that Mr. Robert's prejudice wouldn't vanish overnight. But tonight, they had won a small but significant victory. They had stood their ground, not just as individuals, but as a family. And that, Maya thought, was something worth celebrating. As she leaned back in her chair, surrounded by the people she loved, Maya felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. No matter what storms lay ahead, she knew they would face them together, stronger, wiser, and more united than ever before. And perhaps, just perhaps, Even Mr. Robert had begun to hear the echoes of unity in the quiet night. The next morning, a hush settled over the neighborhood. It was the kind of stillness that follows a storm, as though the air itself was holding its breath. Maya stood in the front yard, arms crossed, gazing across the street at Mr. Robert's house. His blinds were drawn, the windows dark. It seemed the man had retreated into the solitude of his home after the events of the night before. The memory of the confrontation still sat heavy in her mind. They had stood their ground, and for now, Mr. Robert's attempts to disrupt the reunion had failed. But Maya knew that changing people like him took more than one conversation, more than a single act of defiance. She could only hope that the words her father had spoken lingered with him, as they had with the neighbors. Marcus joined her on the porch, sipping his coffee and watching the morning unfold with his usual calm demeanor. "Thinking about last night?" he asked, his voice low and soothing. Maya nodded. "Do you think he'll come around, or did we just make things worse?" Marcus took a long sip of his coffee, his eyes thoughtful. "Change doesn't happen all at once, Maya. It's slow, sometimes painful, but every conversation, every small moment, it plants a seed. What Mr. Robert does with that seed is up to him." Maya glanced back at the house across the street, her heart heavy with the weight of uncertainty. "It's hard to be patient." Marcus chuckled softly. "That's the trick to it, kiddo. Patience is the hardest part." The day moved slowly, with family members trickling out one by one, giving their hugs and farewells. The reunion had been a success despite the interruptions. They had reconnected, patched up old wounds, and made new memories. Maya stood on the driveway, waving as the last of her cousins drove off, a bittersweet ache settling in her chest. As the house grew quieter, the normal rhythm of the neighborhood returned. Maya knew it was only a matter of time before she crossed paths with Mr. Robert again. What she didn't expect was for it to happen so soon. Late that afternoon, as Maya and Marcus finished tidying the backyard, the sound of shuffling footsteps drew their attention. Mr. Robert stood at the edge of their lawn, his posture awkward, as though he wasn't quite sure why he was there. Maya tensed, but Marcus gave her a subtle nod to stay calm. He set down the bag of trash he had been carrying and walked toward their neighbor with an open, easy smile. "Mr. Robert," Marcus greeted him warmly. "What can I do for you?" For a moment, Mr. Robert said nothing, his gaze fixed on the ground. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the anger and arrogance it had carried the night before. I wanted to say I might have been wrong about a few things." Maya blinked, stunned by the unexpected shift in tone. Even Marcus, who rarely showed surprise, raised an eyebrow. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Mr. Robert continued, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. I guess I thought things were getting out of hand, but maybe I overreacted." Marcus nodded slowly, giving Mr. Robert the space to speak without interrupting. The older man fumbled with his words, as though they tasted strange on his tongue. "I've been set in my ways for a long time," he admitted grudgingly. "Maybe too long, and seeing all of you out there last night, well, it made me realize I've got some things to think about." Maya's heart softened, though she kept her expression neutral. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it was something. And for a man like Mr. Robert, it was a significant step. "We appreciate you coming over," Marcus said gently. "It takes courage to admit when you've been wrong." Mr. Robert gave a small, stiff nod, his eyes darting nervously to Maya. "I don't expect you to forgive me," he said quickly. I wanted to say I'll try to do better." Maya exchanged a glance with her father, and Marcus gave her an almost imperceptible nod, encouraging her to take the lead. "We'd like that, Mr. Robert," Maya said softly, stepping forward. "We're not looking for trouble, and we're not here to change the neighborhood. We just want to be part of it." Mr. Robert looked down at his shoes, his face etched with something that resembled regret, or perhaps relief. "I'll keep that in mind," he muttered, before shuffling back across the street, retreating into his house. Maya exhaled slowly, the weight on her chest lifting slightly. It wasn't a grand reconciliation, but it was a beginning, and sometimes that was enough. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to ripple through the neighborhood. Mr. Robert stopped glaring from his windows and no longer muttered under his breath when Maya and her father passed by. On one occasion, he even nodded in their direction. A small gesture, but one that didn't go unnoticed. Word of Marcus's leadership continued to spread throughout the community. Neighbors began approaching him with ideas for improvement, eager to contribute to the neighborhood's growth. The prejudice that had once lingered beneath the surface began to dissipate, replaced by a sense of unity that felt genuine and hard-earned. And though Mr. Robert remained a quiet, solitary figure, he no longer carried the same bitterness in his gaze. Something in him had shifted. Something small, but significant. He was learning, slowly but surely, that the world didn't have to look exactly as he had always imagined it. One crisp autumn morning, Maya stood on the porch, sipping a mug of tea as the leaves scattered across the sidewalk. She felt lighter than she had in a long time, lighter and hopeful. Marcus joined her, his coffee in hand, and they stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching the neighborhood come to life. "You think Mr. Robert will come to the next community meeting?" Maya asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Marcus chuckled softly. "You never know," he said. "People surprise you." Maya smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. They had faced the storm together, weathered the conflict, and emerged stronger on the other side. And while the echoes of the past would never entirely fade, they had begun to write a new story. One built on empathy, understanding, and the simple but powerful act of choosing unity over division. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the neighborhood, Maya knew that there would always be challenges ahead. But she also knew that they would face them, together. And that, she thought, was the most important thing of all. The end was not a resolution, but a beginning, a quiet shift towards something better. And sometimes, that was exactly what the world needed. Thanks for joining us. If you enjoyed this story, don't miss the next one. Click on the video now to watch. We appreciate your support, and we'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments.